So there is nothing hotter right now than AI. And to that end, I am pleased to introduce Jason Allen Grant, has been so kind as to join us from the SMU Yong Kung Hao School of Law in Singapore. There he is the director of the Center for AI and Data Governance. He's also an associate law professor. And for the past decade, he's focused on regulatory challenges to emerging technologies such as blockchain and artificial intelligence. So he's got a few slides prepared for us today, but then we'll leave ample time for questions because I know there will be a lot. So thank you, Jason, for joining us.
Thanks very much, Anne, and for the invitation to speak to you today. This was a very exciting invitation for me. Obviously, as academics, we work away in our little domains, but especially in areas like this, I think there's a keen sense of awareness that universities do play a role in the digital transformation. So my center was set up about 5 years ago. I joined just very recently. I've been director since January to look at AI and data governance. Traditionally, our work has been structured around 3 streams of AI and society, AI and business, and AI in specific industries. For reasons I'll discuss in the presentation, our work stream going forward, we're structuring around data governance, recognizing the importance of data and access to and control of data and use of data, around emerging technology regulation, which would include, things like AI and Gen AI, ChatGPT, which has all been very, very much in the spotlight for the last 6 months, particularly, and then what we're calling digital economy law, and under that we're defining quite broadly just around the question, what kind of legal system do we need? And that includes regulation, but it also includes private law, so doctrines of tort and contract and all this sort of boring bread and butter stuff that we torture our undergraduate students with. What kind of legal system do we need to support a digital database economy? And in particular, in that latter work stream, we're opening some new research tracks around digital trade. And so, when Anne kindly invited me to join you today, I sort of jumped on it. That said, it was a little bit scary, and it is a little bit scary talking to journalists. I'm less used to being on this side of the camera than you guys are used to being on that side of the camera. And it's so be kind, but we'll run through some things. First, 3 kind of preliminary framing thoughts. And as I was preparing my notes, I thought, AI and international trade, how will AI revolutionize or change international trade? And actually, this is a very difficult question to answer because AI is a whole cluster of technologies that many of which are general purpose, and actually AI intersects with trade in lots of different ways. And I've tried in this presentation to sort of bring some coherent order, at least the way that we're approaching them in our research, but it's potentially really open-ended, from contract automation and data analytics to logistics and supply chain optimization. And no one, and least of all myself, is really an expert in all of these different domains. And I think reporting then, that makes it a challenge because but I think, like lawyers, journalists are kind of quite used to getting across different areas in a short space of time, doing your investigation, doing your due diligence, reaching out to the relevant experts. But that's a challenge that I think comes with the territory, both for myself as a researcher and I think for you as in the journalism profession. The second preliminary thought is that AI itself is actually pretty broad and is kind of poorly defined. I actually, AI is in the title of my center, but I sometimes struggle with the concept of AI. Is it really a helpful way of framing technologies to ask, to what extent they mimic human cognition? We've sort of used this approach to these sorts of technologies for decades. The history with the Dartmouth college conference and the Turing test and so forth. But I think a lot of experts do have mixed feelings about the concept of artificial intelligence. And there are also these things like the AI effect, which is that once something becomes kind of established and we can do it computationally, it ceases to become AI and it just becomes software. And so sometimes we're tracking a moving target. We've seen in the context, for example, of the European Union AI Act that defining AI can be quite tricky. And I think in our research, we're very much thinking about AI as a cluster of technologies which work quite differently. You sort of older generation of AI was rules-based or symbolic logic-based. This newer sort of cohort of machine learning, neural network-based AI systems, work quite differently. And AI systems can be deployed to do very different things in different contexts as well. And they intersect with other technologies too, both emerging technologies and incumbent ones. And so this makes it challenging, and we'll have some discussion on that hopefully as well. The third sort of preliminary thought is there's a lot of chatter in the space. Whenever you have, an AI is really characteristic of the tech hype cycle over the decades. We have lots of literature which is pretty aspirational and generic, especially when we're talking about revolutioning this area. Obviously, we've got this impulse towards sensational, clickbaity titles, not pointing any fingers. But, these sorts of tech hype cycles do kind of encourage, futurists and pundits. And I guess it's important to choose whose voice you amplify. So some domains of application of AI in the international trade context, it's really right across the board. So from things like logistics, where we're looking at warehouse management, demand prediction, using, again, this is where it's important to keep in mind the breadth of of tech that we call AI. From big data analytics that's really predictive. That works quite differently and does different things to this, newer generation of generative AI that we've been talking about a lot for the past year. Things like trade route optimization, how you pack containers on a ship. The other big sort of vertical that I use to structure my own thinking is around trade facilitation. And that would include your sort of gov tech and your reg tech and your compliance tech. So single windows have been quite a big thing in the trade law community over the last years, where instead of having to deal with, a dozen different ministries and different customs offices and biosecurity offices, you have a single digital portal where you can submit all of your trade documentation electronically, and then it's shared on that side between the relevant agencies. Automated customs detection, using things like X-ray technology to better detect what's in containers and whether they match the customs declarations. Translation services. So I read, this morning, for example, that when eBay provided translation services, exports to Spanish-speaking Latin America on the platform jumped by 17% or so. And I think we've all seen how things like Google Translate and different AI-driven translation services actually ease transacting across borders and ease that communication. And then sort of post-trade processes as well. An interesting area, and I'd sort of plug some of my colleagues at the Centre have just published a book on AI in financial services. Trade-related financial services, things like trade finance and factoring. Also insurance, there's a large, actuarial science is a large kind of predictive element based on historical data, which is a perfect kind of a use case for this sort of technology. And financial documentation. Again, here we might think of Gen AI, where we're using Gen AI to automatically generate at least the first draft of different financial documents. And then related to that, an area that I've worked in a little bit more is contract automation. And this might not be AI per se, but we've all seen a lot of hype around blockchain-based smart contracts. There's also significant movement towards the development of not blockchain-based smart contracts, but what we might call smarter legal contracts, which are conventional legal documents that have sort of smart clauses in them. So think of, Word versus Excel. Excel has this, quite a sophisticated back-end logic where you can perform different functions. And there are various groups working towards languages for expressing legal propositions like, seller must deliver, the goods by a reasonable time. How do you express these in computable language? So in computer code, effectively, that can then make a conventional legal document with everything that a legal contract is meant to have, but it also maybe has functions of automation, such as, when the temperature in a container fluctuates more than 5 degrees Celsius, maybe a penalty is automatically deducted from the contract price. So these aren't sort of AI per se, but it is contract automation, and it does intersect with AI systems, because once you have contracts which are these sort of digital data objects, as it were, they can start to interact with AI systems in new and potentially beneficial ways. Closely related to that, we've got quite a movement around digital trade documentation. So things like bills of lading. The vast majority of bills of lading are still in paper form. Often the goods arrive before the documents arrive. It's a source, apparently, of huge inefficiencies. But we've had movements with UNCITRAL, for example, promulgating the model law on electronic transferable records. And we have had early movers such as the UK and Singapore who have actually created the legal infrastructure to have an electronic bill of lading. And I think the UK House of Lords just passed the Act last week. And again, this is not regulation, it's a private law. It's a private law act basically saying, yes, you can have an electronic document. It can serve as a document of title. So whoever possesses the document, has title to the goods. But there were some tricky questions in there around things like possession, because how do you possess a digital document? And so there was quite a long process of law reform consultation by the Law Reform Commission in England and Wales, and that's resulted now in a statute which, I imagine those jurisdictions are hoping showcases their prowess in the area of digital trade and things like e-invoicing and so forth as well. So there are some cross-cutting observations which I'd make, which is that, I hope that brief sort of overview and discussion has showed that, it doesn't necessarily make sense to talk about any one type of AI system in isolation. They interact with each other and they interact with other technologies. And the technologies, particularly include things like cloud computing, but will also include things like asset tokenization, for example, in the trade-related financial services. And then the final point that I'd make is I haven't so much touched on, trade in AI systems themselves. And that might either be as products or services. And there are difficult questions in sort of trade law around whether an AI system, a software package, is a product or a service. And there are also, many cases in which an AI system is going to be a component of a product or a service. And, the digital economy going the way it is, these are incredibly valuable products and services. And so that's an important way or an important dimension of AI in international trade itself. But it raises some of its own questions. So, I thought 3 kind of considerations that have been playing on my mind and on the mind of my team over the last 6 months are questions around cross-border data flows. Data access is really crucial for AI development. Whether based on symbolic logic or, these sort of neural network architectures, you need training data. And it's maybe not universally true that more data is better, but better data is better. And to get better data, you all else being equal, more data is good. But there are some countervailing considerations against the free flow of data across borders or trade in data. We talk a lot about privacy and personal data protection. We're also seeing increasingly national security considerations and kind of critical industry considerations. And so we've had a pretty marked trend, at least for the past 5 years, towards data localization, particularly led by jurisdictions like the EU, but also China, just saying, well, at least certain types of data, they just must stay within this territorial jurisdiction. And there are very good reasons for that, which, you'll engage with according to your own policy and political, persuasions. But it does have a negative impact on AI in trade. There are efforts currently towards bilateral data sharing frameworks, such as, for example, Singapore has a whole raft of digital economy agreements with Australia, with the UK, with New Zealand and Chile, which touch on this. There are regional efforts as well. And there's sort of multilateral, broader ones to look for data sharing frameworks. And there, the leading example would probably be the free flow of data with trust, or the data free flow with trust that was, I think, the brainchild of former Premier Abe in Japan, but is a G7 initiative. Really closely related to that, and something that you're all probably much more familiar with than me, is the dimension of geopolitical tension. So we live in this precarious age of geopolitical fragmentation. We've got a big fault line going through this region of the world, and AI is definitely a front line in that. And it implicates not just sort of the software systems and the products in which they're embedded, but the whole supply chain, including, for example, semiconductors, and the sort of hardware tech on which these systems rely. And there are things like technology export restrictions and so forth that we're seeing, as a commonplace feature again of the multilateral sort of trading framework that we've had for the past several decades. The other sort of aspect here is look, certain economies and jurisdictions, especially the US and China, are large AI exporters, and they're also large sort of exporters of data. Because they've got large populations. And, one question there, which I've kind of put under geopolitical tensions, even though it maybe doesn't completely belong, is, how will this impact global equality? If we have a small number of large jurisdictions which are the clear leaders, sort of head and shoulders above the rest in terms of producing these highly valuable and powerful systems with myriad implications across the board, where does that leave the small and the middle power jurisdictions and the emerging economies? And how does that impact sort of north-south geopolitical, but also geoeconomic relations? And then finally, I've listed the fragmentation of the legal landscape. So, we're looking for sort of an AI Act, and especially movements in Europe towards a general purpose AI Act have put that on everybody's tongue. But actually, a lot of AI regulation doesn't happen at the level of a single AI Act or an omnibus AI Act. It happens at the level of tort law or contract law, privacy law, sale of goods law. And if every jurisdiction sort of goes off and does its own thing in terms of, the legal treatment of AI embedded in products or services, that will lead to a more fragmented sort of a landscape and a more complex landscape for traders. There are also some purely domestic considerations which will then potentially have impacts that affect international trade. One of them is certainly workforce displacement. So this is where it's good to be careful about the hype cycle. There's a lot of doomsday predictions. We're all going to be put out of work. Law and journalism are certainly two of the sort of traditional white-collar jobs that are now on the chopping block. Blue-collar and manufacturing jobs have been on the chopping block for a while. I think it's really important not to be alarmist about this, but there is also this general trend towards, we automate certain functions, and that makes production of whatever kind less reliant on humans, and that does change labor market dynamics. That's the whole point of it. And, whenever you have a transition from one state to another state, there's going to be winners and losers, and we have to think carefully about the distribution of benefits and burdens. So, how we've got this potential productivity windfall from AI. How do we distribute that between capital and labor and governments. A related phenomenon is the potential onshoring. So if productive automation suddenly makes domestic production realistic again, then jobs or production may be re-onshored. And this could have quite an impact on trade, especially in areas like textiles manufacturing, for example, or automotive manufacturing. And this ties in again to this sort of geopolitical fragmentation that we're seeing, and this desire in many countries towards, autarky and self-sufficiency, and less reliance on complex international supply chains. And recently as well, Gen AI, opens this possibility for services as well. And one example that I've talked about with technical colleagues who work in the area is things like call center optimization. Using Gen AI, one call center worker can have, much better interactions and much more efficient interactions with clients. And, important for this region where we have lots of Anglophone jurisdictions with large call center workforces, that could potentially lead to the re-onshoring of that type of work. And then finally, I'll mention the importance of inclusion of SMEs and micro SMEs. So again, here the platitudes abound, and we hear lots about how the digital transformation will be great for micro SMEs and SMEs, and building the formal economy and promoting access to formal financial services and so forth. But the implementation gap is real, and it's an important question to actually ask how we get from A to B. So concluding thoughts, because I think I've probably spoken longer than the 15 minutes as I promised. One would be, look, granularity is key. Really do try to be granular in detail, work out what kind of technology it is that you're actually talking about, and what the business model is in which it's being deployed, and what the broader context is, be it geopolitical, be it economic, labor relations, what it's actually being used to do, and avoid those buzzwords. Two is, across the board, mind the implementation gap. There's huge opportunities in this area. I think it's no exaggeration to say that it's potentially a step change in the way that we do things, in the way that we produce goods, but also provide services and generate knowledge indeed. And there's super exciting applications of generative AI, for example, outside of just chatbots and making pretty pictures. It's for things like drug discovery, metallurgy, it's a huge area of promise, but there are important legal gaps and infrastructural gaps to be addressed. And part of that includes, trade law and sort of the trade ecosystem. And so finally, looking at the broader context, in this area, I don't know what your experience is, but at least in my experience as an academic, discussions really often get stuck either at the level of platitudes and sort of motherhood and apple pie statements that nobody disagrees with, or sensational sort of claims, and buzz. Or they tend to get shunted into conversations about WTO law and treaty law on the one hand, and personal data protection and privacy law on the other. And there's hugely important areas of law and regulation for AI in international trade, but they're not the whole conversation I think that we have to be having. And so one consensus that's building with me and a group of colleagues is, we really want to try to shift the conversation more broadly than just sort of treaty law and WTO law to look at actually cross-border commercial law. And it's dry and it's boring, but that's actually where a lot of the implementation happens in terms of, is that electronic document actually enforceable as a document of title in the relevant jurisdiction? You can have a treaty which says, it should be, and you can have a model law which says it should be, but you've got quite a lot of work to do at the national law level to work out how to get there. And then on the other hand, privacy and personal data protection is really crucial. And, there is so many cautions. I don't think I even need to stress that. It's so important. But as we've seen, there's these other aspects to data governance as well. It's about innovation. It's about national security. It's about critical industries and self-reliance, and what kind of, multilateral versus autark kind of trade environment we want. So I will stop speaking there though, because I think I have overrun.
Oh, I'm sorry. We have someone over here for this.
My name is Erika. I work for Forecast News. I'm based in India. You spoke about asset tokenization. Correct me if I'm wrong. Singapore is leading when it comes to asset tokenization and programmable finance, right? Even Singapore's central bank have also been experimenting with DBS and some of the other financial giants when it comes to asset tokenization. Can you elaborate with some examples where that stands now? Last we heard it was still on the implementation stage. Has that made any progress? Are there some use cases? What is the realm reality right now? And what is the future of asset tokenization in Singapore and elsewhere in the world?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. So I've done quite a lot of work on asset tokenization. I'll be honest, most of this has been more at the level of some of the conceptual, especially property law aspects of it, and less at the level of sort of current policy developments. But you are right. I think certain jurisdictions, especially common law jurisdictions such as Singapore, also the UK or England and Wales in particular, have taken quite a leading role. I think it's necessary to distinguish. They are sort of practically and technically and also conceptually related, but between things like central bank digital currency, sort of broadly defined, and asset tokenization. In general terms, what we're talking about is the representation of some type of asset in a digital data structure, and that digital data structure is often based on blockchain or some other type of distributed ledger technology. And what we do is we treat the sort of cryptographic token as if it were an asset, and therefore manipulations of that cryptographic token within the relevant information architecture counts as legal dealings with the asset outside. Here too, there's been quite a lot of aspirational stuff around, for example, tokenization of real estate. That's actually, I think, one of the applications which is further off, at least if we're talking about the direct tokenization of real estate assets. What we tend to see is that tokenized real estate is a tokenized security or other financial asset in some kind of mezzanine or special purpose vehicle structure, which then owns the conventional real estate asset. In other areas, there's quite a bit of action here and in other jurisdictions around, tokenized securities and debt securities and equities and so forth. And then, the other use case being money. So in terms of the current state of play in Singapore, specifically around CBDC, I am aware MAS has been collaborating with other central banks and has been looking at it, but I don't think I can comment in much more detail than that.
I'm Matt. I'm with the South China Morning Post. I wonder if you could talk more about how specifically, if you have any specific examples of how AI is being used in logistics. Is this being being used to help manage trade flows, or how will this affect where companies want to manufacture or ship through? Is AI helping in any respect there? And I'm also wondering if you see any impact from the U.S.-China trade war, if AI is kind of bifurcating between these two markets. Could that affect where these different types of AI technologies develop, and how that is also used in trade, and how specific companies or regions trade?
Yeah, thank you. Again, great questions. I have a feeling we're going to have lots of questions digging into the detail and use cases and examples, for which, I must apologize. I may or may not be the right, I may or may not be your guy. I know that there are Well, I know probably most large logistics and shipping companies would have some sort of program going on. I am aware that some sort of made moves in the space earlier, and then it sort of didn't go anywhere. I think that's been pretty characteristic of AI development over the last sort of decades. And there's lots of these applications where we're sort of waiting for the inflection point. And I think, again, I won't and I can't, because I can't accurately name specific contemporary examples. But I have discussed things like container packing. So where you put what goods in a container, but more particularly where you put what container on a ship, and how you plan that route. There's talk around, making the route of ship passage more dynamic and responsive. For example, the price variations in different markets. Again, I to my knowledge, we're not really there yet. In terms of impacts on where things are being manufactured and shipped to and from, and the kind of fragmentation process that we're experiencing at the moment. I think that would stand to reason. I'm struggling here. I may. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Matt.
Like which countries are kind of getting access to these like AI technology?
Definitely. Yeah, I think so. I think we're probably going to see an increasing increasing sensitivity around what sort of products are available in which sort of markets and jurisdictions. I think it's already happening at things like the hardware level. I know that there's been discussion around the need to make source code available, for example. And of course, making source code available in the context of AI is really important because we want things to be transparent. And we want to know where and why things have gone wrong if they've gone wrong, and we want to know how the sort of black box is functioning, and yet, it's highly sensitive, trade secret, or commercial secrets that are, I think, increasingly going to be subject to overriding national-based restrictions. So we do, I'm a lawyer. I'm a sort of a lawyer by background and training. So we have this general phenomenon of, I guess, regulation lag, and especially in fast-moving spaces like AI, as we've seen, for example. And maybe it's unfair to take something like the EU. EU package of digital regulation, because the EU is a bit of a special lawmaker. It's this, regional, multilateral kind of a thing. And, that's even slower than, for example, a national legislature or national regulator. But things take time, and good and sound lawmaking takes time. And law is, per se, just always a little bit responsive to the market and to technological innovation. And there are good reasons for it to be that way too. We don't want innovators to only be thinking about, what has been sort of ex ante cleared. We want them to come up with the best ideas and products and innovations, and then, we respond to those dynamically through time. So that being just a structural problem that, regulatory theory has to kind of account for. Is the cat out of the bag? Are we sort of too late? Have all of the harms, been done and they're irreparable? I certainly don't think so. I think at the moment we're seeing a little bit also of a bifurcation in terms of commentary on debates about AI risks. And one camp is kind of the existential tech apocalypse camp. And they're particularly concerned about, long-term big picture questions of AI and alignment with human interests. And then, there's another camp which says, well, that's actually a little bit of a distraction. The technology, we're just not there yet. We may never get there. We should be concerned with things like, data protection. We should be concerned with things like fake news. We should be concerned with things like workforce displacement and, labor dynamics. I think there's often a trend to, and it has a name, but there's a tendency to overestimate short-term impacts and underestimate long-term impacts. But I don't think that we're at the stage where any deleterious sort of trends or effects have been unleashed yet that we couldn't respond to effectively on a regulatory and legal level, especially if we had effective, multilateral cooperation, either at the regional or the global level. I think one of the things that does concern me about Gen AI specifically is, for example, the generation of, the mass generation of dodgy content, of misinformation, and how that's going to interact with, the attention economy that we've already got. We're all, scrolling through social media. But I think we're still in relatively early days. I think that's me being optimistic rather than naive. And then I think your second question related to not just labor dynamics, but also sort of the net impact of AI, and will it be sort of an overall net plus or minus? I think it'll definitely be a productivity plus. My question is how's that going to be distributed? And maybe I'm a little bit heterodox here, but I think looking at the history of automation, automation has increased productivity. It's increased standard of living around the world, but unequally. I don't think that, or I don't expect AI to be any different. There was a lot of optimism last century about automation and cybernetics and especially digital technology and ushering in this era where we could all work a 3-day work week and be philosopher poets. Actually, it's getting harder and harder just to be middle class, even in the wealthiest developed economies, and we're all working longer and longer hours and have less financial security. And we have, on the one hand, a glut of material wealth, but in the last 15 years at least, worrying trends of increasing inequality within economies. And I guess globally the situation is some of the trends are more positive, but I am optimistic about AI boosting productivity. But I do think it's imperative that we have a conversation soon about how the benefits and burdens are distributed.
Hi, I'm Andrea Sanjuan. I work as a trade and industry reporter for Business Mirror, a newspaper in the Philippines. My question is, let me just share that in the Philippines, the business process outsourcing sector is one of the growing sectors in our country. So we're heavily banking on that sector. But then since one of your slides noted that AI has an impact on onshoring or services exports, can you give us an overview of how serious the threat of AI is on the services exports and the outsourcing sector?
Again, I'd qualify that with, I'm not an economist. I'm also not a futurist. And I think I finished with a crystal ball here, but I don't actually have one. So I think, I listed that as a potential impact on international trade. From my conversations with people who work in the industry, and here I won't sort of, from conversations with people who work in the industry, there is some really promising signs that call center workers assisted with sort of a Gen AI chatbot, so like a, like coders have a co-pilot, and at the moment, call center workers have sort of a script with sort of a decision tree that they'll work through. But with something like a chat GPT driven co-pilot, their interactions with customers can become a lot more efficient and effective. And they can successfully resolve a customer inquiry in a much sort of lesser period of time. I think, there is the potential for that to lead to onshoring in industries such as call centers. But I think equally, and I guess that's where questions of access and cost and so forth come in, and domestic innovation, that sort of technology is also available in offshoring sort of markets. So yeah, short of making predictions about the economics of it or the way that things will develop, which I don't think I'm qualified to do. I think for every one of these risks there are responses as well, and there's mitigation approaches. And if businesses, I think, are agile and are innovative and have access to the necessary technology, there's always going to be comparative advantages, especially in things like labor costs, to the extent that human labor is still a component.
Hello, this is Monira. I work for Financial Express in Bangladesh. You touched on labor market. My specific question is how AI impact on labor market composition. Can you provide any specific example of any country how AI impact the labor market? Bangladesh is a densely populated country, and in my country, industry is growing, but there is unemployment, and fresh employment is not taking place. Thank you.
Yeah. Again, and I'm so sorry. I feel a little bit like the wrong person to be speaking to you, because again, that would probably be a better question for a labor economist. So I think it's going to depend on, I guess, the profile of the specific industry. And it may be that, for cases like Bangladesh, which, where, for example, textiles is a major manufacturing sector, it could well be that, other automation technologies are actually a greater threat to, labor security than AI per se. In terms of specific examples of countries where AI has had, one or the other type of impact on labor dynamics, I don't think I could comment down. To you.
Hello, so I'm Jamil. I'm from Vietnam, covering Vietnam market for Singapore's The Business Times. So my question is that from a national strategy point of view, from a country point of view, when should a country focus on developing an AI industry? Are there any specific strengths or like specific characteristics of a country that you think they can leverage to develop an AI industry or an AI ecosystem? Because like for the developing country, they have other priorities and they need to focus on other industry as well. But whether or not they should also support AI and like frontier technology like that. And my second question is that I heard that technology, AI researcher and innovators are trying to they want to go to country that have looser regulations, AI regulations, so that they can implement their research project in AI easier, because they are tired of like following the rule and compliance in AI in EU country, for example. So is this a good thing for a developing country like Vietnam to like not really care about the regulation at the moment in terms of AI, and just leave it to other nations like the EU to do their job on that, and we just developing the technology.
That's a really good question. I'll start with the second one first. I mean, that's an important policy choice that any country has to make, especially in the context of emerging technology. We saw a little bit the same with, for example, in the blockchain space. I certainly would not encourage any policymakers to engage in a race to the bottom. I don't think that, radical deregulation is necessarily an advisable sort of course of conduct. That said, I think, it is legitimate for different jurisdictions to look to local circumstances. I think we've seen this big and very intentional extraterritorial effect from the EU, particularly. So the Brussels effect. That's not been universally well received in other parts of the world, including here in our region, based on the perception that, look, actually, there are different values and there are different attitudes and sort of, cultural approaches to things like AI and data regulation. And so I think it's legitimate for countries to, assess what their situation is, assess what their policy goals are, assess what their community values are and national priorities are, and then formulate an AI policy accordingly. I think I'd always, stress the importance of regional, collaboration, especially for small and middle powers. Or small and middle-sized jurisdictions. I think, Singapore is probably a good example of a middle way. It's, I think, successfully cultivating a reputation for being a very pro-business, pro-innovation jurisdiction, including when it comes to AI. I think in other areas such as blockchain as well, we've seen Singapore's willing to establish, pretty clear guardrails where there's perceived, consumer or systemic risk. And, the approach, as I understand it, that we've been taking here in Singapore is to, very much build consensus and take a collaborative approach with the relevant industries. And that might be a good role model for other jurisdictions in the region here, without adopting a race to the bottom. I think, the race to the bottom is never good, and runs the risk of attracting actors that you don't necessarily want to have. So I'm struggling to recall the first question though that you asked.
Country? When should a country focus on developing an AI industry? Yeah.
So, again, I'd like to sort of just caveat this with, the limits of my sort of technical knowledge. But I think, most countries, I mean, Vietnam has actually a large economy, right? It's a developing country, but it's got a large economy. We've got quite a lot of economies like that in the region here. There's obviously a leading role being played by your very sort of large tech companies in AI development. There's an important role that's been played historically and is being played now by things like university and other publicly funded research institutions. But I think, to the extent, but there's also an important, for example, open source development movement. There's, as I understand it, a movement towards, developing, for example, large language models with smaller numbers of parameters that'll be computationally more efficient, for example. That's, I think, as I understand it, been traditionally one of the capital constraints, is just getting access to compute power. I think, it's probably within the realm of the feasible for jurisdictions like Vietnam to actually, promote a domestic AI development. Again, it might not be at the level of building, doing this sort of at this stage, building foundation models, or there's going to be a certain path dependency in terms of who the leaders are, and they're going to have predictable names from big tech companies. But I would be optimistic. For example, here I know of a couple of university projects where we're working on developing domain-specific LLM tools, for example. And I think, the more people we have involved in the development of this technology, the more, I guess, representative of, different jurisdictions, different cultures, it will be, the more diverse the sort of data training sets will have, which is, as I understand it, a very good thing. And it's often people from jurisdictions who understand, the needs of that market. And so I think that would be quite a positive thing as well.
And if I have a question?
Sorry, I have a question. So in China, there's been a lot of restrictions placed on data transfer outside of the territory, mostly geographical limitation. If you're outside the country or you're a foreigner, you won't be able to access a lot of data, economic data, business data. Do you think there is a general trend on the rise of jurisdictions putting limits, similar types of limits on their data about their population or economy? And what would be the implication on the application of technology like AI on trade areas? Because I suppose China being a big economy, it will be important to have their information.
Thank you. So from what I understand, the restrictions, the data localization measures in China are probably the most extensive at the moment. And they're the most squarely based around considerations, I think, of national security and critical infrastructure, but also I guess critical industry. There is, you're right though, a broader trend towards data localization. The EU GDPR is similar as well, and the emphasis there is very much on personal data protection. But there are other considerations that find their way into that as well. I think as kind of a global community, we do stand at a little bit of a crossroads in terms of which way things are going to develop. I think the risk is of data balkanization into different data blocks. And I think that would have, negative spillover effects into lots of different areas, including trade, for the reasons that we've talked about today. We'd have, things like AI systems being built in and for specific markets and jurisdictions and trained on domestic data. I don't think that would be necessarily a good thing. I think this is the interesting thing about data, is on the one hand we think and we talk about it and it functions as sort of a commodity. It's the new oil, or in the Chinese context it's a new factor of production, and yet it's not really like oil, because fundamentally it's non-rivalrous. You can share data, and we can all have access to the same body of data, and we can all use it, and it's sort of not exclusionary like that. Your use doesn't diminish its value to me and vice versa, only if we make it a zero-sum game. So I think, there's good reasons for which the traditional, sort of multilateral consensus view is that we want the free flow of data, albeit with robust protections which are internationally recognized on things like, personal data protection and privacy, and legitimate national security interests. But yeah, I think that ball is in spin